I'm delighted to introduce Frank Douglas. Delighted that he's here with us. Frank, born in Mississippi and spent the major part of his professional and personal life in New York City. Frank, if you want to unmute yourself so we're ready to go. For the last 20 years, he's lived and worked outside the US, over 17 years in the UK, and most recently as CEO of Keras Executive. Keras Executive works with private equity firms, international companies, and professional service firms interested in maximizing the performance of their organizations through effective leadership, diversity inclusion, and transformational HR programs. And prior to this, Frank has extensive senior HR experience at Scottish Newcastle, Transport for London, and BT. Frank is the first, and we understand still the only Black male to be the Group Human Resource Director of a FTSE 100 organization. So very special to have him here today. So a very warm welcome to Frank. And on to the first question. If we can have the spotlight on Frank, thank you. Frank, you have a wealth of experience working with organizations. Why do you think many struggle to attract and retain ethnic minority workforce?
Thanks, Javed and Raj, for having me here, and welcome to everyone. So it's an interesting question, Javed, and I, having been a dyed-in-the-wool HR person, I know HR folks want a process. They want to leave here with a process they can plug and play in their organization, and some of these things aren't processes. And so why do they struggle? And with our work, and we work with major companies. We work with the largest pharmaceutical companies, the largest music companies, all for the UK broadcasters. We partner with them from 3 to 18 months. So our insights are based on being behind the curtain. And one of the things I've realized is that after George Floyd, a lot of companies jumped on the train. Their competitors were on that train. They saw everyone on that train, so they had to jump on, and they jumped in solutioneering. Now, I know you're looking for solutions and actions, but I think that's part of the challenge. So what have I found in our clients and talking to many people is that we have to go back to basics. So one of the issues is that many people are confusing or conflating diversity and inclusion. And so I would ask you to ask 3 questions of your HR and your leadership teams. Ask your senior leaders to describe what diversity looks like in their organization. Ask them to describe what inclusion looks like in their organization. And more importantly, ask them, how does inclusion help their business objectives? Now, that may sound rather basic to you, but what I have found is that actually a lot of companies, and I even say respectfully, a lot of D&I practitioners actually conflate diversity and inclusion. And that is the starting point of the problem, is that inclusion is a fundamental reimagining of your relationship with your employees. And if you ask a lot of leaders about inclusion, their answer actually will be about diversity. You say, yeah, how does inclusion help you? They will say, well, because we have diverse workforce and we have different opinions. No, that's not inclusion, that's diversity. So part of the struggle, I know it sounds rather basic, but part of it is that we actually don't understand the lexicon of the issues. And what inclusion is a fundamental challenge to the status quo. The other thing I would say about inclusion and why we struggle is that if you run your organization in a hierarchical manner, that's a barrier to inclusion. And most organizations, they have all these D&I initiatives, and they still run it in a hierarchical manner and believe they're being inclusive. But as you go up the pyramid, and if you hold your meetings just with your top senior leaders and the grade below, it's not representative. The other challenge I would say, Javed, very quickly, is the other confusion is that we don't really understand the difference between assimilation versus inclusion. And what many companies are doing are putting in programs to fast track assimilation. And assimilation is, this is who we are. We have this diverse talent pool. We're going to put in programs and initiatives to help them fit into us. Inclusion says we have this diverse talent pool, women, ethnic minorities, disabled, age, and others. And what we're going to do is find out how we have to change our way of doing business, thinking, to accommodate and leverage that talent pool. And so the other challenge is that we still haven't really cracked the nut between assimilation versus inclusion. And then lastly, retention and this goes throughout all of this, it's about leadership behaviors. Leadership behaviors are not really a part of the conversation as much as they should be. It's unconscious bias, it's a training, it's a workshop, it's a new policy, it's a new initiative. And then the 10 folks in the executive suite, next agenda item, we signed off on that, and they go about business as usual in their hierarchical way. So there's some basic issues that I think are the challenge, Javed, in terms of understanding diversity and inclusion and understanding what inclusion really means. It's not tick box, it's a fundamental challenge to the status quo.
Thank you. And you touched upon it. So a number of organizations kind of roll out initiatives or I call pop-ups to tackle race inequality, and they don't work or they don't make an impact. You touched upon some questions that when we had a good conversation before, you said there's some key questions that need to be asking before implementing the initiatives.
I think there's one key question every organization needs to answer first in terms of their executive team, where it starts. And that is, where are they on the myth of meritocracy? Do they believe in the myth of meritocracy, which is able-bodied white men are the most talented people in the world? Or are they prepared to challenge the myth of meritocracy, which says, nah, there's got to be something else at play here? That is the most determinant question I have found in terms of those organizations that are serious and moving into all, and those that are not. So the first question is, where are they on the myth of meritocracy? And so what you find is some companies actually, they believe in it. They believe that, in the myth of meritocracy, we got the best people. If they're all white men who live in the home counties, so be it. And then there's others who have the humility and curiosity to take that step back and say, something's not right here. The other challenge, and you've mentioned part of the other issue, is that many companies, because the need to show action, have used off-the-shelf solutions. And Raj has alluded to that already, is that what we have found is that inclusion and culture, progression and retention are specific to a company. It's not even an industry issue. As I said, we've done deep dive work with the 4 major broadcasters, pharmaceutical companies, music industry. There's very little that's an industry issue. They have different HR policies, they have different leadership styles, they have different engagement programs. And so it's the it's the one size fits all that has been a barrier to success because it's not specific to the needs of their workforce. It would be like going to the GP and he or she gives you percent penicillin because penicillin is a good medicine. It cures a lot of things. Yeah, but I got a broken leg. So it has to be specific to that. The other issue is that we need to acknowledge that gender is different from race. And a lot of companies believe that we can use what we did for gender and move those sort of initiatives and approach to race. It's totally different. And in fact, I have to say I was disappointed at the last Parker review where they stated that, part of what they should be building on is the lessons learned from, the gender movement. It's not the same. So let me just give you this rather penetrating glimpse at the obvious. Every white man knows a white woman. Penetrating glimpse of the obvious. But the point is that most white C-suite executives have women in their professional orbit, and most white C-suite executives have women in their personal orbit. Very few white C-suite executives have ethnic minorities in their professional orbit, as Raj has rattled off the statistics, and even less so have them in their personal orbit. That distance creates stereotypes, it creates discomfort, it creates a lack of confidence and capability in dealing with the issue. So part of what companies also need to understand is success in gender does not mean you're going to be successful in dealing with the race issue. And then I guess the last thing I would say is the equity issue. Companies and HR policies are still monolithic. They're one policy that applies to everyone. And clearly, if you're going to be focused on equity, you need to put it where it's needed. Now, that's an interesting point because Actually, if you've sat in on executive team meetings deal with equity every day. They deal with equity every day. And you know what it's called? It's called resource allocation and capital allocation. Every CEO deals with that every day. Where are we going to put our resources and our capital? We got one machine producing 10 widgets and another producing 7. Let's find out what's happening with that 7-widget machine. We do that until it comes to talent. For some reason, when we get to the talent conversation, we abandon that discipline of resource and capital allocation. And what you find is that, those who suffer the most are the underrepresented employees. So there's a discipline there, but as I said, there's a discomfort in the race issue, and you need to challenge that and understand that. And you also need to understand, is the company serious about challenging the myth of meritocracy?
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. So drawing on your experience, what have you seen has the greatest impact when it comes to tackling biasness in recruitment, progression, and promotion?
Yeah, and I know the audience is going to be looking for a process they can walk away with, but it's not a process. I worked at Shell, and when I moved, Shell at the time had a gold-plated talent management process, and someone said, "Well, can you give us the Shell process?" And I said, "No." Because it's not a process. It's about it's what's on a leadership agenda. It's what they talk about. It's how often they talk about it. And so what really moves the dial here is the starting point, is that you need to start with the voice of the employee. You don't start with a 2-day away day with your top 10 senior leaders coming up with a D&I strategy that they roll out to the organization. You start with marketers do. You start with the voice of the customer, and the customer in the workforce is your employees. You find out what's specific to them. What are their challenges? What are the things they feel in the organization? What are the things they see? Do they see unfair secondments taking place that impact them down the road? Have they had to anglicize and shorten their name for the assimilation part of the culture, because the culture is not really, looking to fit them into a new way of working. And so that voice of the employee is very important. The other thing is that you always need to ask yourself, is what we're doing informative or transformative? And so, there's some informative things that are very helpful and needed, but you need to distinguish between informative and transformative. And the challenge there again is that most of the efforts in many companies has been on the informative, because they have not taken the step of challenging the myth of meritocracy, the focus on hierarchy, and their fundamental reimagining of their relationship with their staff. And so, if I look at some of our clients, Warner Music, Universal Music, Universal being the largest of the two. What's interesting about them is they both recently IPO'd. And so they're at the top of their game. But in both their cases, they were willing to take that step back and do the deep thinking and have the humility of curiosity, saying, well, what got us here in the past may not keep us there in the future. So let's really think about the new culture, the new evolution that we need in our organization. That humility and commitment is very important. The other things I look at, Hogan Lovells is one of our clients in the law firms. One of the things we found there, it's very subtle. It's not always obvious things. It's what I call goes without saying. Ethnic minorities, Black trainees, did they really understand what it took to be a partner? Because in the magic circle in law firms, there was always this assumption, it goes without saying. Everyone wants to be a partner. Well, if you're a first generation versus a second or third generation lawyer, you may not really understand that. And so they put in a program, for example, called Demystifying the Partnership. And so it's a host of things. You need to start with the voice of employees to understand where they're coming from. You need to be sure that the CEO and the leadership team are really interested in this. It's not lukewarm acceptance. And I think that's the challenge, is that most companies can't outright reject the race agenda. So the next step up is lukewarm acceptance. And that's where I think we're stuck at. And so the issue is, are you at lukewarm acceptance, or are you at embracing and engaging and understanding it? So it's about a commitment. It's not a process, Javed. And I know, people are looking for, something they can go back with. But I think that's the problem. We have jumped to solutioneering a little bit quick and not done the commitment. So one last thing, I know my time's running out. It's one of the things that many companies do is diverse recruitment panels, for example. Now, let me tell you what I found in diverse recruitment panels. 9 times out of 10, they don't work. Why don't they work? Because what we've told people is go find a diverse employee to put on the panel. Well, given the nature of most organizations, women and ethnic minorities in particular tend to be lower down on the pyramid. So you put them on that recruitment panel, and guess what? The hiring manager is still more senior than that diverse member of the recruitment panel. And when push comes to shove and the hiring decision has to be made, the ethnic minority will not change that decision. So, solution, if you want to really have impact in a diverse recruitment panel, the ethnic minority needs to be equal or senior to the hiring manager making that decision. Otherwise, hierarchy will win.